So yesterday, I covered the latest comments from George Lucas, where he opened up about his thoughts on AI, prequel backlash, and why Star Wars fans and fans of IPs in general should not be the ones to dictate how a studio or a filmmaker crafts their stories. And it's been captivating to see how people have responded, especially Star Wars fans, because it once again goes to show you that we often like to impose our own views on George. He's the maker, so we see his view as the golden standard, and because he doesn't make too many public statements these days, we like to make broad assumptions about certain things he likes or agrees with, even if he himself never said those things. And I think we're all guilty of this to some extent, but have you noticed, every time George Lucas does open his mouth, every time he gives a new interview, without fail he'll say something which no one saw coming. He'll say something which takes us all aback. And today, my friends, I'm not even talking about his pro-AI stance, which by the way, did get fans very upset, but no. What I'm talking about is George's criticism of studios who play it safe when making films, those who cater way too much to fans. He flat out said, and I quote, "The audience doesn't know what they want to see. Nowadays it's all about what the fans think. That isn't how you make a movie." And this comment has sparked some pretty interesting reactions, because on the one hand I think George is right to defend the sanctity of a filmmaker's vision. The artistry should always come first. But on the other, in 2026, I suppose you could argue that his comments come across as a little bit out of touch, at least where it comes to fandom culture these days, but also quite literally what studios have to do to make money. In principle, I actually agree with George, because his comment comes after his criticism of focus groups, but he says that creatives should follow through on characters and stories that they're passionate about, regardless of what fans think. The issue with this is that it's a little bit hypocritical. For one thing, you could argue that a major problem at the moment is that fandoms are not being listened to. And second of all, he didn't apply this philosophy himself. Jar Jar Binks was supposed to be the new star of the prequel trilogy. He was meant to have a big role in episode 2, but when fans expressed a dislike of him following the Phantom Menace, he reduced him to the role of a senator who most of the time is in the background of the film. And on this whole subject of giving fans what they want, I think it's important for creatives to give us their own stories, their own perspectives, but at the same time, with a franchise like Star Wars, while we're a very divided fandom, while we're a fandom full of people with all kinds of opinions and theories about what Star Wars should be, at the end of the day, we all expect a base level of familiarity, and I guess what you would call fan service. It's why Luke's moment in Mando Season 2 worked so well, Vader in Rogue One, Anakin in the Ahsoka show, Maul in Solo. Even entire shows like Shadow Lord only exist because these are characters that fans care about, and it works. But I do think there's a balance. I do think it's important to try and be original, but with George, we know he takes a far more radical approach. He wanted to make every new Star Wars installment different from the last. This is true of the prequels compared to the original trilogy, and we know the same would have been true for his sequel treatments. As a storyteller, George actively resisted repetition. He often argued that giving audiences more of the same was creatively bankrupt. Every Star Wars trilogy was intended to explore a different era, but also different themes, different worlds, and even different understandings of the Force. And this is why, had he made his episodes 7, 8, and 9, his ideas would have become even more radical, because he expressed wanting to explore the microbiotic world of the Force. We're talking about the Wills, the midichlorians, and the way the midichlorians communicate with microscopic life. But here's where things get very interesting, because the subsections of Star Wars fans who feel particularly vindicated are those who are defenders of the more controversial projects, Last Jedi fans and Acolyte fans. Why? Because whether you like those stories or you hate them, they're the best examples of recent Star Wars projects that deviate from the norm, that strayed from the typical Star Wars formula. I always feel there's a pressure to land Pandorin with these projects, but even though there are those who say it's not Star Wars, to me, it shares many of the same themes as the original trilogy, so I don't see it as subversive as something like The Last Jedi or The Acolyte. It's not as deviant or quote-unquote anti-fan. Fans of these kinds of projects have taken George's words as an endorsement. They think maybe he was a fan of them. And from this arose a question which I've been dying to know the answer to for years and years. How did George Lucas feel about The Last Jedi? Moreover, what does he think of The Acolyte? Now again, I want to be careful because, as a fandom, our knee-jerk reaction is to assume he despised them. People have said that The Last Jedi is an insult to George Lucas' Star Wars, but the man himself hasn't said too much about the film, and we know for a fact he watches some Disney Star Wars TV shows, he liked the Kenobi show, he visited the sets of Mando, so maybe he did watch The Acolyte, and, as uncomfortable as this might be, he might not have hated it, but again, it's all conjecture. What we do know for a fact is that George disowned the sequel trilogy. A few years ago he came out and said 1 to 6 are his, and afterwards they went in a different creative direction. We also know he wasn't the biggest fan of The Force Awakens. He publicly decried the film and said that it didn't do anything original. But what about The Last Jedi? Because this is where things are a bit more convoluted. Because George, in his own words, said that filmmakers shouldn't mind what the audience thinks, they should follow their own creative vision. And so based on this, you can sort of understand the points that The Last Jedi fans are making. But let's take a look at this claim. What is known about George's relationship with Episode 8? Well, for one thing, Luke's arc in The Last Jedi has its origins in George's sequel treatments. Their stories do differ quite a bit. They both go into exile, but for very different reasons. Instead of becoming what people like to call Jake Skywalker, Luke didn't go into exile to become a recluse, because he lost his nephew to the dark side. In George's version, he exiles himself in much the same way a Buddhist monk would, to meditate upon deeper truths of the Force. But in terms of George's own personal opinions on the film, we know for a fact he did not attend the world premiere in Los Angeles in December of 2017. Instead, he watched a private screening, and his reaction, according to his representative, is that he thought the film was, quote, beautifully made, and he personally complimented Rian Johnson. However, that doesn't mean George fully liked the film. Even as someone who's not a fan of The Last Jedi, I can call the film beautifully made. The visuals are superb. It is a gorgeous movie to look at, but in terms of its themes, in terms of the way Luke is treated, Rey's arc, we have no idea what George thought. But as I said at the start of the video, we shouldn't put words in George's mouth. But I would love to know his honest reaction. Same with The Acolyte. But when people talk about these projects and they say that George Lucas would hate them, we have no clue what George would think. I mean, he's known to have some pretty hot takes. He likes the Minions, for goodness sake. And something else which has been making the rounds is George's reaction to Rogue One. If you remember, 2 or 3 years ago, Tony Gilroy said that George loved it. He had a 45-minute conversation with Tony on the phone, and George said he was a big fan. But in that same interview, Tony Gilroy alluded to some criticisms that George had. He doesn't elaborate on what those were, but if I had to make a guess, it might be to do with the way the film ends, even though there's the moment of hope with Leia at the end. Because George always insisted on the heroes having an uplifting fate, I wonder if he wanted Cassian and Jyn Erso to live. Or maybe it was to do with the lack of the Force, or for all we know, it was quite a jokey criticism. But Tony Gilroy overall said that George loved it. But returning to this AI thing, George saying that AI is the future of movies really seems to have rustled a lot of feathers. Here are some responses. Being a Star Wars fan is a humiliation ritual. This one says, this is such a ridiculous take, and I'm shocked he'd ever praise something that is quite literally stealing art from humans. This is so disappointing. This one says, wow, what a horrifyingly bad take. But you know, I'd be surprised if George said anything different. He's been defending new means of technology since, the 70s. He was such a huge proponent of digital, of CG. He's always been enthusiastic about new means of telling stories. But it's interesting there's a bit of a generation divide. Younger fans very much against George, very surprised by his words, disappointed even, whereas some of the older fans are just like, well yeah, you've just got to roll with it. But those are some of the latest responses, reactions, some thoughts I had. What do you guys think? Share your reactions and your thoughts in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this one, please be sure to give me a big fat thumbs up, subscribe if you're new, and may the Force be with you always.